thank you all for sticking around, and I hope that even more people will come, because this is going to be much more interesting than the boring lecture that I gave. They are really fun people, and actually they are really smart people, and actually they walk the talk, so that's going to be really fun. So I thought it would be better than me reading out a long, boring list of what things they are doing. I thought maybe they can all, I would like to ask all of you individually to just give us a brief introduction about yourself. First of all, what is the thing that you do for work on the climate? Not yet. Okay. So, András, what is that you're doing for the climate in your work as a professional? We saw that there are many things we can do. You work as a professional. What is that you do as a professional for the climate?
Yeah, thank you very much. And first of all, it's great to be at SZIGET Festival. Well, not yet on the main stage, but maybe some years later we will be there in evening hours. So I'm a lawyer by profession, but that doesn't really matter. Actually, I would say I'm a climate activist by profession. I used to work for the government for a couple of years at the climate policy department, so I was responsible for carrying out negotiations, for instance, creating the policy framework which we are operating within. So that was my previous role, and now, since 2020, we established a think tank, I would say, a Hungarian-based think tank, the Green Policy Center, and I'm leading that. And basically what we are doing is we are trying to speak in the language of the government and try to convince them to do the right things in terms of climate change and other sustainability issues. So that's how I would summarize my profession. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. And now let me go to Katalin, because she's another person from the three who is influencing the climate through her profession. So Katalin, introduce yourself, please.
So good afternoon, everyone. So by training, I'm a biologist and a lawyer, but I've always been working as a lawyer, as a climate lawyer and environmental lawyer. I teach environmental law, and I'm also working as a chief legal advisor to the Hungarian Ombudsman for Future Generations. And in these my capacities, I'm also advising many climate lawsuits on the domestic level, but also on the international level. I'm helping the European Network of National Human Rights Institutions, which intervenes in the pending climate lawsuits before the Strasbourg Court, the European Court of Human Rights. We try to have the applicants, so Portuguese children who are suing Portugal and 32 other European states, and also the climate seniors from Switzerland, where thousands of Swiss elderly women are suing Switzerland for not doing enough, and by not acting ambitious enough against climate change, their health and lives are severely threatened. So this is the work I'm doing. I'm trying to legally articulate climate unambitious measures as human rights violations, and we try to act against it on the domestic level and also in the international level.
Great. So finally, Emma, we are really fortunate to have. She actually traveled from far away to here, and also right now, because she's young, she's not yet able as a professional, but Emma, please tell us how you're working for the climate in all your other personas.
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you for having me. Yes, I'm Emma. I'm 22. My day job is I work as the president for my student union in Exeter in southwest England. And then the other half of my life I spend with Just Stop Oil, which is a non-violent direct action group advocating for the UK government to stop licensing new fossil fuels. So yeah, those are like my 2 day jobs.
Fantastic, thank you very much. So to go to a little bit other areas of your lives, I want to ask each of you to identify one thing that you do for the climate that you, in one of your other personas, that you don't really normally tell to other people, so which is kind of a secret or you're not so proud of. And I will start by perhaps breaking the ice. I actually read the book Clean, which inspired me a lot, which talked about how actually oral hygiene culture is influenced by corporate interest, and all are overhyped about, you know, the cleanliness and hygiene. So actually I take much fewer showers, so I rather keep the distance. No, that's not the reason, but that's one thing I actually do for the climate. So what are your things that you don't openly advertise often?
Well, I'm also a mother of 2 kids, and so that was the sort of turning point when I realized that raising kids would mean necessarily raising and generating many plastic waste. So I changed from disposable nappies from washable nappies. My family were partly supporting in these efforts, but I found it very rewarding personally. I mean, seeing all these clean nappies all the time, and then seeing that you are not generating so many wastes, like really you are filling like bags of nappies if you stick to the old disposable ones. So that's my sort of guilty pleasure in being a mother and helping the kids being raised in the most sustainable way.
Well, that's very heroic, having raised 7 kids, and I knowing how busy Katalin is, and doing that, I think it's very exemplary. So Emma, what is your crazy thing?
So something I do that I wouldn't normally share, which is good for the planet. I mean, I do a lot of like traveling, and I always like take my own tea, but this is like such a small thing in comparison to like, the crisis. I guess like reusing tea bags quite a few times. I think that's something I do very regularly just because, why not get more out of it?
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you, Emma. András, what's your crazy thing?
I think the craziest thing is that this is my job. Because it really eats up my mental health sometimes, and I'm serious, although we are laughing, but it's not an easy job, to be honest, because you have to face all this truth every day, what you just showed to us, so it's not easy. But I also think that any other thing would not make sense to me to deal with in life, because this is our big problem, our huge challenge, and I felt like I have to deal with this. But to deal with this every day and mentally staying healthy, it's a challenge. So it's kind of crazy to read all day about all these processes, but I still love it. So probably that's the craziest.
That's absolutely the utmost craziest thing. And in fact, I know that you are just coming also from somewhere crazy. You sacrificed another crazy thing for being us with even more crazy people who, instead of having fun out there, are talking about all this serious stuff. So where are you coming from? Can you tell a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I kind of coming from a different dimension, I would say. So it's called a PDC, which stands for a permaculture design course. I don't know how many of you have heard about permaculture. Basically, yeah, there's one there. So don't listen. So permaculture is like a way of designing our territories in a way that it's in line with the processes of the natural processes, basically. And one of my favorite principles of permaculture is observation. So before you do anything with the environment as such, observe it. How does it work in that particular territory? And I really like it because, as you said, our infrastructure processes starts with cutting off all the trees, all the grasses, basically ruin the territory as such, and I don't know, put some artificial stuff there instead of the natural processes. And permaculture is all about listening to nature, and it's also about fulfilling our needs, which are not exploiting the environment. So basically, for me, permaculture is kind of the answer to the sustainable development definition, because it says that we have to fulfill our needs in a way we are not compromising the needs of the future generations, and this is what permaculture is all about. And so I was there in that design course for 2 weeks. I was sleeping in a tent, even during the craziest storms. We even used compost toilets, which was also a new experience for me. It's not that bad as it sounded at first, so you can get used to it. Basically, my biggest learning experience was that how fast you can adapt to new circumstances around you. And basically, I came back to Budapest yesterday, and within 5 minutes, I think I produced more waste than I produced the whole 2 weeks at that course. So it was crazy, really. And I have to go back tomorrow morning, so I'm really looking forward to it. And I met with people who are so filled with content. I'm not sure how to tell it better, but they were so knowledgeable. They knew so many things about how the nature works, how animal works, how the plants works, and yet although they are working all day on these lands, they are super intelligent and they are aware of Sándor Vörös and other philosophical writers, the works of them. So they are also very, very smart people, and I really love to be in their company. So it was a great experience for me, and I would really recommend it to try to find these communities, because they are living in quite closed communities. They are very dependent on each other, but they are living a very meaningful life. That's how I would put it.
Thank you. Well, I'll have to take that course too. So I wanted to ask if any of you has also anything crazy that you do for the environment, which you normally wouldn't share, but you want to follow suit. Not right now, but if you are thinking about it, please, if you think of one, please put up your hand. So let's get to the more serious stuff. You had to, and I'm sorry that you were forced to listen to my lecture, but beyond that, what do you think would be the one biggest thing why you think we are not able yet to bend the emissions curve? Why we have not been able to kind of stop emissions and then go them into decline, when we know the IPCC has shown so many times we have the technology. It's not going to, I didn't show all of this because I didn't have time, but we actually, it's not going to cost the earth. We know it's actually going to be cost effective. We have the political will, at least some sort of political will, but it's still not happening. There are so many net zero commitments. So what is the one thing that you think is really at the root of this whole problem? And let's go from Katalin.
From a lawyer's perspective, I would say that one of the still defining challenges that none of the big branches of power in the state want to take real responsibility and wants to drive this change. So we see that there are some political commitments, mainly on paper, mainly on international level, sometimes on the domestic level, but these diplomats and politicians make sure that these commitments are not couched as binding legal obligations. They are more like symbolic promises. One of the main problems is I think that politicians also do not want to deal with these things. They're highly controversial, they're highly sensitive, they do not want to be voted out of the power for addressing these very sensitive issues. So politicians try to avoid making decisions and measures for the short term. I mean, so they do not want to adopt long-termist measures on the short term. So, another very defining problem is the short-termist bias built in our democracies. So democracy as such, unfortunately, is not suitable for thinking for the long term, thinking about future generations, because only present generations vote, and only those who are enfranchised, so those who have the power, the right to vote, they vote at the elections. So of course, politicians, not because they are bad persons, but because they know who their constituency is. They know who will vote for them at the election. So they will, unfortunately, inevitably favor short-term economic gains, and by these short-termist measures, they generate risks for future generations and for the long term. So this is why I think that politicians, in a way, they do not want to address these issues. But again, we are ordinary citizens. We are also, our brains are just not wired in a way that would be very suitable for thinking for the long term and making sacrifices in and now, here and now, for long-term hypothetical. From a psychological point of view, it's hypothetical, but like from scientists' point of view, it is very real. But my point is here that, unfortunately, the human brain is very much trained and was evolved during millennia to be focusing about the future, the near future and the present, and perhaps on the past. Enacting very ambitious long-term measures, long-term trajectories, how will we really reach net zero by 2050 by the end of century. This is just a time scales on which individual humans can have trouble thinking about. And then my last point is that the judiciary, so courts, also do not want to deal with this. So they are the third big branch of powers within the state. So the basic instincts of courts have always been that we do not deal with political issues. We do not deal with scientific issues. And climate change is by definition very scientific and very political. But at the same time, there are very strong arguments that we can make that because harmful climate impacts cause human rights violations, and human rights violations are something that the courts could and should and must deal with. So my point is here that I think courts should be better prepared for dealing with climate change. But the reality is that in many jurisdictions and many courts and many individual judges feel that we do not want to deal with climate change if it's possible. So there's a very famous quote from late Justice Scalia, who was a longtime member of the Supreme Court in the United States, and it was around 2007. So it was not so long ago, and it was really not long before the Paris Agreement was adopted, the first climate change litigation case in the U.S., and there was a trial, and Justice Scalia just openly said, you can read on the records, that, well, it's global warming. I do not want to deal with global warming. I'm a lawyer, so I have to tell you the truth. I do not want to deal with climate change at all. At the end of the day, the climate plaintiff won, but you could really have the feeling that this is sort of the orthodox or old school approach of a very highly trained, very intelligent judge. So he was not necessarily a bad person, but he was trained in times when this is how lawyers and judges were ought to think about complex issues, that they are just lawyers, they want to deal only with purely legal issues, they do not want to touch upon highly technical, highly factual, science-intensive questions. And this is definitely one of the big challenges in my field, so why climate change litigation is fast developing, but it's not as fast as it could be.
Thank you. Emma, do you agree with that? What do you think is the biggest thing that's holding back big change?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many issues which is holding back the progress and stopping politicians from making change. But I'd have to say, the one thing, for me at least, that is holding back progress on climate action is a failure for politicians and the big governments, the rich governments in charge, to fully engage with the climate crisis on an emotional level. If we'd engaged with climate change on a rational level, we would have made progress on it. Decades ago, when James Hansen first said, the greenhouse effect, climate change, this is a man-made thing and we can stop it. If we'd taken action on a rational basis, we would have taken action by now, but we haven't, and that's because people in power, predominantly in the global north, who are most responsible for this, are failing to engage on it on a rational and emotional level. If you're not affected by climate change, if you don't know someone who's been really affected by it, you're not going to want to do it, and you can very much remain in your protected echo chamber, your bunker, metaphorically, because the people in power are going to be protected by this, and the people who are least responsible are having their homes washed away, burn, everything. So I think that's what it comes down to. I think it's, there's so many reasons, obviously the fact that the world is run by money for now. There's all these different reasons, there's all these different intersections, but I think if everyone, and including ordinary people, engage with this issue on a deep emotional level and understand that the climate crisis isn't a green scientific issue. It's literally life or death. It's literally your survival and your children's survival. Then people would spring into action, and I think that's what a lot of people where I'm from in the UK who are taking action and literally risking everything. I've got friends who are currently in prison for climate action, and it's because they've actually taken that time to engage with this and understand that if we don't take action now, we can't do anything about it. It's not just this niche green issue, it's everything. And I think engaging with that on an emotional level allows people to actually fully see it. And I think in some ways it's like this psychological failure to engage with it because it's so huge. Politicians, people in power, obviously the corporations, they don't want to engage with it because it means like genuinely changing everything. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
András, what do you think?
I completely agree with Emma's point. I had three points because I couldn't pick which one is the most important, I would say. So I completely agree, and I wrote down that maybe it's funny to say this, but maybe the consequences are still not sure and frequent enough, especially in the developed world, because I like your differentiation between rational and emotional induced action. And I think fundamental changes always comes after emotional catastrophes like world wars, things like that. And once we experience climate catastrophes, probably the emotional impact will be that big that much bigger impact changes will occur later on, which means partly that we are already late, right? So that's the most difficult part of climate action, that when we will feel the huge consequences, which we are not yet experiencing, probably we will be already late because those processes will be over the tipping point in some ways. So that's the most controversial part of climate action. The second thing I wrote down is that, and I saw it on a meme, that we do not need more green things, but we need less things. But if you think about it, it's not a business of anyone to have less things, right? So there are no financial interests behind to have less things, but that would be a huge part of the solution, I would say. So that's the second point. And the third one is also extremely important, and I'm curious if you agree or not, but I see much less positive visions in terms of the future. So I recently had a conversation with someone, and she told me that she attended a course where the task was to find a contemporary artist picture which paints the future in a bright way, and she couldn't find any. All the paintings about the future were quite dark ones and not that nice ones. So if you cannot think about how we are going to live in a sustainable world, how can you move towards it, right? So I think it's extremely important to have a sustainable and tempting vision about our positive future, which we want to move towards. So that's the third point, I would say.
Excellent, thank you very much. So now, just very brief, if you could remove one thing from the world, from society, from anything, what would be the one thing you would remove in order to make things happen?
Can I start?
Yes, please.
Maybe it would be too economical, but when I was coming here, I was thinking about this question, and nothing else really came to my mind which would really affect everyone other than putting a price tag on pollution. Because nowadays we are not paying for it at all in so many goods and services. So basically it's just left out as it doesn't exist. But we all know that it exists. And if we would put a huge price tag on that, and in parallel, of course, reduce the less pollutant goods and services, the prices of the less pollutant goods and services, that would make a huge difference. Because I already gave up the hope that everybody will be an environmentalist and tree hugger and all these nice things. People do care about their own purses, their money, what they spend on. Just think about what happened with the gas consumption of Hungary recently, where the prices went up radically, the consumption went down radically. Surprise. So I would really believe in this as a first step. Maybe it will not solve everything, of course. But as a radical first step, of course it will turn the market upside down, because probably greatly different products will be more popular than nowadays. But yeah, that's the side effect of that. So I would say this to your question.
Very good, thank you. Emma, what would you remove, the one thing?
New fossil fuels, I think, and the emphasis on the new bit, because if we ended them today, things would start to go a bit crazy. But yeah, I'd say new fossil fuels, because that would force governments and current like oil, gas and coal companies to find an alternative, and we have the alternatives, like they are there, and we've got, you know, up to about 9 years in reserves of fossil fuels, and like that's the main driver of the climate crisis. Like everything that we use, everything that we have is like made of these things which are also killing us. So yeah, I'd have to say new fossil fuels, but done in a way which is like a just transition out of them, so that we don't just like, you know, get rid of loads of people's jobs and all that kind of like the social stuff to it as well. But yeah, I think that would be very hopeful.
Thank you. I think that's a very fair thing to say. Kati.
But it's interesting because my first, when you first mentioned that question, my immediate thought was the polluter pays principle, which just András mentioned. So, but yeah, I also believe that it's really part of core problem that all the ecosystem services that we use, no one pays the price for it. So there's no price tag on pollution. Everyone treats the atmosphere as an open sewage. So this must be transformed, and for doing that, we should have reach a sort of paradigm change in environmental law, because unfortunately our environmental laws have always been like this. So we try to limit. Actually, no, we sanctioned a bit pollution, but we never tried to limit the underlying transaction. So like everyone treated that as a given, that economic development is the thing that we want to protect, and then if they cause some sort of side effects, some externalities, which means pollution and killing people, then they can carry on and they can go on, but we would just like try to maybe we would fine them, like they would get an administrative fine, but no one would, you know, sanction, no one would suffer a criminal sanction at the leadership of that company. So we have some really structural gaps and limitations in how our environmental laws work. So like lawyerly speaking, I would try to fix that, but like idealistically speaking, I would say that we should somehow reform democracy itself. So we should try to correct this myopic bias, so that the democracies are only and almost necessarily about the present and the short-term economic profits. We must find legal ways to articulate the interests of future generations and give a legal weight to intergenerational equity. So we must find ways to articulate that we don't only owe some moral obligations towards our children and the future, but we must be able to articulate these obligations before a court, and we must be able to sue companies and states and everyone who do not respect the essential basic rights and needs of future generations. And actually, we see some emerging hopeful signs in this respect in terms of international environmental law and climate litigation. But definitely, I mean, we are coming up against these short-termist walls, which is democracy about. But there are some novel ways of making decisions. Like there are some initiatives called climate assemblies or citizens' assemblies, and there are institutions like mine, where I'm working for part-time, is the Ombudsman for Future Generations. So there are some institutional corrective mechanisms with which states are experimenting now, which try to give and inject long-termism into state decision-making process. So I would target the polluter pays principle and intergenerational equity, I guess.
So can you explain us what is a citizens' assembly? I hear about this so many times now, and I know that some countries are experimenting with this. What is that exactly? Yeah,
there are several models, but like the basic idea is that when you make long-term legislation, so when you want to think about how our net zero world should look like by 2050, then you should really ask the people, and then you should ask random people, and not just from the elites, and not just from scientists, but there is a way of randomly selecting people from the local population. You would gather these people together, you would give them some basic knowledge and then ask them to just brainstorm, and then so make some common decisions, and sometimes it's very surprising that they come up with surprisingly wise and wise solutions that are very common sense, but they're actually working, and these decisions can be more legitimate in the eyes of the public, because these are sometimes about transformative change and transformative changes in the way in which we are living. So these changes cannot be mandated from up from the top, but must be coming from bottom up, because then people that it's quite intuitive, but there are also ample research showing that people are accepting those decisions more in which they could actually participate. So this is why we need effective and real citizen participation in making these impactful decisions.
Fantastic. I hope that many of you will try to encourage your countries to have citizens' assemblies. So, Emma, I want to come back to one thing you said. You mentioned that many of your, or several of your friends are in prison, and that really took me very strongly. And in fact, one of the reasons why I recommended Milestone Institute to invite you, and I'm so grateful for the Institute to have invited you, is because I was actually very strongly influenced by some of the movements of the Just Stop Oil movements. For example, I actually never heard about it before. Before I was invited for a big television debate, where 4 of us were debating the actions of Just Stop Oil. Where how many of you have heard about Just Stop Oil? 2, excellent. Then maybe she can introduce it a bit more. But before that, how many of you have heard on the news when these crazy people smeared tomato paste over Van Gogh pictures? Almost everybody, yes. So that was, I think, exactly the point. Anyway, the point of the debate was to basically show how terrible thing it is that young people do damage to culture, and really they shouldn't risk our culture in the long term. Well, you have to know, and I'm sure you know, that actually no culture was harmed, because 2 hours later all these galleries were reopened, because all these pictures are of course protected by glass, so you cannot do damage to them. But in the end, it did cause that in the far, far, far corner of Hungary, far away from where all of this happened, there was a big national TV debate on climate change, which actually rarely happens. But it did result in this, that in the end we had a whole hour talking about climate change and why the youth could come to these crazy ideas of doing things like smearing tomato juice over pictures. So in my understanding, it reached its goal, because at least we talked about climate change. Nevertheless, I also didn't hear about them before, but it did have a very deep influence on me. Since then I know, and I have actually several colleagues, scientist colleagues, who are either in prison or have been sentenced to prison, but in the end didn't go there. One of my colleagues, Julia Steinberger, who is the daughter of a Nobel laureate, physics Nobel laureate, and she just did nothing else with the colleagues, just went into a Swiss bank in its beautiful white marble foyer, and they spread coal powder on the beautiful white hall, because in protest of the bank still supporting coal investments. And they were sentenced to prison because of damage to property. In the end, fortunately, they were released, or I don't know what's the right legal term, but it was termed that, good cleaning actually was not even necessary. Good cleaning, you just need a proper cleaning without anything to get rid of this. But anyway, what I really want to ask you, Emma, you as a representative of Just Stop Oil and many other movements who are risking your freedom, you are risking your future. You are in one of the best universities of the world, you are studying, you have everything to you which would ensure you a smooth future with your good paid job, a well-paid job, a nice house, a good, nice cars, and so on. Why you clearly, with engaging such actions, you and your friends are risking this. We know that sometimes many of these activists are not able to have the careers as this. Why how can a young person like do with a really bright future in front of you? Why do people engage in this? Can you just share us a bit more with this? And before I give the word to Emma, you will also be able to ask all the panelists. So also you are welcome to think about questions or provocations or your thoughts, sharing your thoughts. So just keep them, remember them. So Emma.
Yeah, I mean, I think in ordinary circumstances, throwing soup at a painting and running onto football pitches with like orange powder, jumping onto snooker tables with orange powder and disrupting like massive cultural events makes no sense. But the thing is, we're not in ordinary circumstances. We are, facing by 2030 up to 1.2 billion people potentially unable to live in their homes because it will be uninhabitable. So I think, when we're looking at any of these like tactics, and in the UK, like the media loves to focus on like how climate activists are doing things. And I was recently in a documentary and it was just focused on like our tactics, and it mentioned nothing about climate change. It mentioned nothing about like huge displacement in Pakistan because of flooding, and none of the impacts of the climate crisis. And yeah, I think I don't want to be having to like throw away like my future. I think like that sucks. And so many young people are having to completely change course because they've learned about the climate crisis, and you can't really go back after you like have fully engaged with it. However, I don't really think that there's a future where I see myself having like a conventional job if I'm not fighting for that future and fighting for the circumstances where people can even exist. If you haven't heard of Just Stop Oil, I'd recommend like looking them up on like Instagram or social media and looking at some of our actions, because they are kind of weird. I think you could look at them and be like, why have they just done that? Like, why have they interrupted the opera? And why have they like thrown paint at like a flower show? And it's to create that psychological disruption, because we failed to engage with people like with politicians by doing things like the conventional way. And recently I was part of Extinction Rebellion in London. We had about up to like 90,000 people around the Houses of Parliament, all asking for like climate action for an end to fossil fuels. And we got like no media attention at all. Like the only media was our own media. But then, like a week later, one of my best friends jumped on top of a snooker table with some orange powder paint, and it got like so many headlines. He was on the front cover of like 4 newspapers with the demand, because he was wearing it on his t-shirt, like Just Stop Oil. And it caused massive like national, if not international debate. And we have to do things also the weird way, because our government is clamping down on our rights to protest. And from what I understand, like in this country as well, it's like a lot harder potentially, maybe like on an emotional, psychological level to protest. And we've had to go about things like a weird way, and like a more disruptive way, because everything else is being like banned, like it's illegal. And we've just finished 13 weeks of slow marching in London, which was basically a way for us to kind of like, I guess, hack like the law against protesting, because the government recently brought in the police crime and sentencing bill, which makes a lot of ways of like conventional protesting illegal. However, it excludes slow walking on the road. So we spent 13 weeks, like thousands of people, we all like alternated based on our region. So I went with the Southwest region for 3 weeks, literally just marching on the road until we got stopped. Some people got arrested and taken off the road, and we just did that day after day for 13 weeks. And that caused, again, like national headlines, national outrage because of the way the media is controlled. But it was only when we went to disrupt like normal, ordinary people that we got like interest. So yeah, we're having to like take these actions and risking like our freedom because we don't really see an alternative. Because what's the point of just like getting a job and going about things the normal way when everything else is literally like falling apart around us? And we know that the main driver of the climate crisis is new fossil fuels. So that's like our one key demand at the moment is no new oil and gas. So yeah, if you want to find out more about Just Stop Oil, I would say like check us out online and just see what we're doing. And I think we are like the biggest climate movement in the UK, and if not like internationally at the moment, just because we're made up of so many like brave people, but they're all ordinary people. Like we've all got like normal jobs, and we're all, you know, trying to just live in this world, but also refusing to comply with the status quo, because the status quo is what is killing us. So, yeah.
Wow, thank you, Emma. That's certainly very, very strong motivations and very, very taking. It's hard to speak after this. Before I have many other questions, but before I go on, I do want to give all of you an opportunity to either throw questions at us, or give any comments. That's something that you disagree with or you had further thoughts on. But no, don't worry if you don't, because we certainly have lots of things to still continue discussing. So actually that makes me ask you a question that I did not share with you before. It's a very controversial question, but it's actually about democracy versus climate change, because you already also mentioned that that democracy or a present model of democracy doesn't really serve the future. Emma mentioned that, well, first of all, it's great that in advanced Western democracies we can have civil movements that actually make a difference, because, yes, I forgot to ask, but my understanding was that actually Just Stop Oil had quite an impact. For example, perhaps can you mention that, what happened in Scotland and how much influence Just Stop Oil had on that?
Yeah, I mean, so our demand of just stopping oil has been endorsed by the Welsh government, the Scottish government, and all the major political parties in the UK, apart from our current sitting government, the Conservative Party. So yeah, we are like winning, like 100%, but it's just become such like a political tool to kind of either support or hate Just Stop Oil, that despite the fact the International Energy Agency and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said no new oil, that our Conservative government is saying, oh, it's, you know, just a left-wing issue. So yeah, we are winning.
Excellent, because at least we had some headlines that Scotland is announced that they are going to discontinue approving new gas and oil fields. But as you say, it's not that black and white, but still it's a significant win. So in developed Western democracies, certainly civil movements can have an impact. Nevertheless, we see also the downsides. For example, the COVID gives me sometimes a bit of a worry, because our developed Western democracies allowed, you know, at least 5 million deaths by COVID, whereas some of, you know, the less developed democracies were much, for example, Singapore and Taiwan and so on, were much more able to protect their citizens against a big public threat. Of course, it was some autocratic measures, but still, there were almost no deaths and almost no economic crisis as a result of the pandemic. And I very often thought about if there is a strong parallel between climate change and the pandemic, because we are suddenly facing a big threat. And I felt that where Europe lost it often was when the first protest happened about the masks, and people started, you know, I don't want to wear a mask. Okay, well, if you don't, okay, well, I'm fine. So, but it's okay. I can't force you to wear a mask, but it's allowed to infect others and cause deaths. In Hungary, I am on the board of one of the major foundations of COVID-related orphans. We have more than 1,000 children who became orphans in Hungary, or just in our database, because it's voluntary to come to us, whose parents died. So it was fine to infect others. Anyway, so the question is, really, what are your thoughts? How can we solve climate change in democracy? And if there are shortcomings, is there any way to fix? And I have no answer, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't have democracy. I do want to state that, because I gave an interview and they didn't make me check the interview. So the headlines was last week that Diána Ürge-Vorsatz wants eco dictatorship, which is clearly not at all what I'm saying. But it's really interesting because democracy came up in many of your interventions. So I'm just curious, what are your thoughts about these? Let's start with Kati.
Yeah, well, to just jump on my previous thoughts, and I just want to mention one thing. So I think that even though children and future generations cannot vote, but the youth could vote, and by youth in Europe we mean population aged between 16 and 29, and we know that this segment of the population in the EU takes up roughly 16% of the population. So if you think about that, it's almost 1/3 of the population. Basically do have a right to vote, but you also know that there is a huge amount of political disillusionment and disinterestedness, which being a Hungarian, on one hand I totally agree with and I can identify with, but I also believe that this must stop. We cannot afford that others are making decisions instead of us, and then so your youth must have their voices heard in some way, and we must find ways that we keep our democracies healthy and alive, and we can only do that if we engage in local level in any ways that we deem it possible. But people must have strong views about all sorts of policies, including climate policies, and we must express our voices and opinions, and we must be able to engage in meaningful debates. We must hear opinions that we normally would not agree with, and we must somehow keep this healthy discourse alive. Of course, I don't know the details, and I don't have a recipe for how to save and change the world, but I do believe that we need to somehow, on a very individual and very local community level, we must keep this discourse alive, this debate alive, and democracy alive. So I very much hope, and as a lawyer, I'm fairly positive. As a self-fulfilling prophecy, I hope that democracies will prevail and will solve the problem of climate change. And we must start it at a very local level within our families, within our towns, town councils, and of course, then we need to reach the global level. But all of us must start preferably today and on a very local level.
András.
Yeah, I have 3 quick points. I haven't really thought about this question for a long time, so it's kind of
I know, this was a nice surprise question.
Yeah.
Provocation.
First point is, I want to make it clear that I would definitely choose to live in a democracy instead of a dictatorship in any case, so that should be the headline of this conversation. Secondly, a philosophical question came to my mind, which says that, can you save people against their own will? So if people choose not to be saved, then do you have the right to save them instead or against their own will?
That's a good point, but do you think they are consciously choosing not to be saved?
If you think about the COVID case, I would say so. So there are people who absolutely consciously choose not to be vaccinated for various reasons. I don't want to go into the details, but you can always ask this question, like because all of us have had our knowledge from different sources, right? So you cannot say that, oh, this people is the best informed in the whole world or things like that. So of course your decisions are based on information which are not necessarily, or most of them, I would say 99% of them are not your personal experience, right? You just read them somewhere or you just heard it somewhere. So it's really difficult to decide who knows best what. So that's also a philosophical question. But the third point I wanted to make is that if you think about the 2 biggest polluters in the world, the best democracy, the United States, and the most famous dictatorship, China. So they are equally polluting the environment regardless of their political system, right? So basically I wouldn't associate climate change with democracy only. So I would also
I didn't say
investigate the implications of a dictatorship on pollution, on the effectiveness of solutions, and so on and so forth. So let's not pick only democracy and start to question whether if it's the best way of our lives and so on. So you
that, of
no,
course.
but I just wanted to highlight this, that you also have to focus on how less democratic systems deal with these kind of problems. Because if you think about COVID, and I'm not an expert at all, but they said that the aftermath of COVID hit some less democratic countries worse than democracies, I would say. So it's not black and white, I would say. So yeah.
So, Emma, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, it's kind of expanding what we mean by democracy and not restricting it just to like voting. You know, like protest and, you know, freedom of expression is an essential and a core part of democracies and how people have made change in the past. Like, you know, women's right to vote, civil rights, ending South African apartheid, has all been like a core part of those movements have been people on the streets, on mass numbers. So I think it's, you know, expanding what we mean by democracy to include and not to, you know, there's a whole spectrum of ways that people engage with politics, and it's not like villainizing protest. And that's what's happening, you know, in the UK at the moment. It's kind of saying this is the only way you engage, like by putting a cross in a box every 4 years. Like, that's not democracy. And something we've done at my university is people's assemblies about how the university is partnering and accepting money from Shell, like the fossil fuel company. So, you know, we've had people engaging and doing protests, like I've been doing like disruptive stuff, but we've also been making like a really like healthy way for people to engage if they don't feel comfortable protesting and being on the streets, by like coming to a people's assembly and saying like, no, we shouldn't partner with one of the worst polluters globally. So yeah, I think yes, democracy, but also kind of like not just this narrow version of engaging with your MP or like signing a petition.
Excellent, thank you very much. So lots of great ideas how the multiple facets of democracy can operate, and not only putting that cross in that box every 4 years. Let's go to a more personal level. So I want to combine two questions. So one is, because most of our audience is from the youth, however we define it, it doesn't matter how we define it. What do you think is, what would you recommend young people who want to engage one way or another, how can they engage? And because to suggest that we don't expect them only to save the climate for us alone, also because I mentioned all the different personas we have and how we influence the climate. So which is, the second question is, which is your battle that you just gave up fighting? Which is the front where you think you are losing against your own fight against climate change? Let's start with Kati.
So the first, what was the first question? Sorry, I just...
what do you recommend youth? How can they better engage? As a lawyer, what would you suggest them? What could they do?
Well, as a lawyer, it's a very interesting phenomenon that we see around the world. This is called a youth-led litigation. So there are many instances where actual minors and youth are suing their own states, and they are proved to be ever more successful. So these youth-led litigation is driving real change. So, for instance, in Germany, when a couple of group of young persons sued the federal government for enacting unambitious measures in their climate law, then the Constitutional Court of Germany agreed with the complaint, so they abolished the climate law, and then the German state complied with the judgment, so they enacted a more ambitious law. And we also see that the reasoning of the German Constitutional Court is proving to be very influential across the borders. So now we have seen these transnational movement of successful court victories, and the reasoning of the court can impact other courts, and so they can drive changes in other states as well. And their successful youth-led litigation can also have indirect, very impactful impact. And this is that research has been just published showing that when there is a filing of a court case against a fossil fuel company, let alone if there is a court victory. This very moment hits the stock prices of fossil fuel firms quite harshly. So the very fact that there is that the possibility that these companies could be sued will decrease the firm's value on average with 0.4%. But that could be very impactful. And then so this is all about what youth-led litigation can really change on the ground, legally speaking. And your second question was what I'm not doing enough. Yeah, but I'm failing still.
Before we go to that, can you ask you, if let's say he wants to decide that, okay, I will decide to take a legal action against my government, but how does one start? I would have no idea how to start. What do you do?
Well, it depends on the actual jurisdiction. So the rules of standing, the rules of rights to bring a claim to court depends on your jurisdiction. So you should consult your lawyer. But actually, there is a very impactful NGO called Our Children's Trust, they are primarily based in the U.S., but they are helping lawsuits all around the world, and they are specialized in bringing youth-led claims to court. And actually, they are just organized or helped. A very impactful case, which is currently pending before U.S. courts, where a group of children ranging between the age of 5 and 21, they are suing the state of Montana, and this is the first tortious climate case based on the rights of future generations and right to a healthy environment against a U.S. state. So it is going to be, if it's successful, it's going to set a very powerful precedent for children and youth around the world to claim that they have specific rights stemming from the right to a healthy environment, which can be possibly used in front of courts of other jurisdictions as well.
Okay, so let's park the second question and perhaps let's go through the one. Emma, what would you say?
I think just be brave to kind of challenge the status quo, because at the end of the day, like, taking climate action means fundamentally changing your lifestyle and changing and questioning your friends, questioning your family, questioning just what's normal. And then I'd say, if you can, join a group, join like a local group, join a national group advocating for action on the climate. And then if you can't do that, so no one's getting away with not doing anything. If you can't do that, look at what you're doing at the moment. Like, if that's at work, if that's, going out to the pub, whatever, and picking to do something sustainable, picking to do something and questioning business as usual. I think that it really takes a lot of courage and bravery to kind of step into action, and you have two choices. Like, in the climate crisis, there are two choices. The first choice, and they're both uncomfortable, the first choice is to not do anything, and that's uncomfortable, and the second choice is to do something, and that's uncomfortable at first, but it will feel a lot better in the long term. So I'd say it all comes down to like bravery and like looking and seeing what you can do, but not feeling alone in it. I think that's something that I spent about, I'll answer the second question now, but I spent about like 2 years, trying to be like zero waste, like a minus carbon footprint, and I realized that was just impossible. So then I've become imperfect, but I've realized that actually doing action, being on the streets, is a lot more impactful than like running around looking for like recyclable dental floss. So yeah.
Thank you. András.
I'm not saying this because we ran out of time, but Emma just took the words out of my mouth. So I cannot add more wise points than she mentioned in terms of what youth can do. In terms of the second question, I was thinking about for so long to start to be vegetarian. I wouldn't say I gave up, and definitely I experience even easy ways to be vegetarian or vegan. For instance, during this PDC, which I mentioned in the beginning, we always eat vegetarian food, and they are extremely various, and you can have so many different things. Probably that's the key, that if you can easily access different kinds of vegetarian food, then that would be much easier, at least for me, because most of the times I buy my foods at some places where there are no choices, basically. So this battle is still not yet won, but it's still being fought, I would say.
So let's go back with the second question to the other two panelists quickly. And the reason why I'm asking this, because I think a lot of times we go into denial when we try, just like Emma, to find recyclable dental floss or to minimize our last little thing of waste or give up that holiday altogether or whatever. And then if we fail and if we think we did too many sins, then we go into denial and think, oh, it's actually not such a big problem and so on. So it's important to admit that we cannot do everything. So I thought we will share with you which are our own fights that we have given up. Mine is that I know flying is really bad, but right now I think if I didn't fly for work, I think we would be even worse off. And I see my colleagues, I have actually many really amazing scholars, friends whom I really admire, but because they don't travel, they can't participate in IPCC, and I'm very worried about that because I feel that these kinds of voices are not integrated within IPCC, and so that as a result it's probably biased in certain perspectives. So I wish they just made some exceptions. So I think, so that's mine. So what is yours, Kati?
Well, there are many. I couldn't cut back on dairy as much as I wanted. It wasn't hard for me to cut back on meat, but dairy is something. It's really hard for me. I have a driving license and don't drive, but our family does own a car. I take everywhere my kids to. I chose those institutions which were in the walking distance, and I take the daycare and the kindergarten on foot, but of course it doesn't apply to the whole family. So of course there are some ways of reducing our carbon footprint. But I guess it's the main thing is that none of us can, or probably not even should, become a climate saint, but we must all of us do all sorts of these low-hanging fruits that are only about lifestyle changes. And even though we cannot be perfect and we cannot reach zero carbon footprint lifestyle, but I think we can all improve every day. And actually it's a very creative process. If you think of it as a challenge, it's better to think of it, and it's more fun than, it's not necessarily a sacrifice, but more like a challenge, which can be fun.
Thank you. So the last question to Emma is actually going to be different. Emma, you are the youngest among us. What gives you hope? Why are you still positive despite all the negative, all the terrible things we've been talking about today?
Yeah, great question. I think what gives me hope is like seeing progress being made in the weirdest of circumstances. I do like a little bit of work for my friend, and every week we put together a list of like positive climate stories that have happened that week. And it gets like a lot of attention, and we get a lot of messages saying like, you know, your posts are like keeping me hopeful and everything. And I think just seeing the impact of climate movements, and like on the train here, because like last week in my post that I did, it was all about the French train company installing like new solar panels and all this kind of stuff. And then on the train here, I like looked out the window and I just saw like loads and loads of solar panels and wind turbines. And I just had this like feeling in my stomach of like something is happening, like stuff is happening. And I think it's so easy to just like stay, especially in like in the work I do, of like just constantly being, you're kind of like constantly frustrated at the government and politics and everything. But sometimes it literally takes like looking out of the window, like literally or metaphorically, and just seeing that like your actions are having a difference and like little things are changing. And like, you know, I've been vegan for 5 years, and when I first went vegan, like it was hard to get like soya milk, but now I can get like oat milk like everywhere. And it's like, it's such a small thing in comparison to like what we're up against, but you do really have to like hold on to the things that are happening, whilst also like letting that hope like fuel continual action.
Well, thank you so much. It was really so great to have you all. And I do encourage everyone that if you want to stay around to chat with the people here, they are really unique guests who now you have access to, especially fantastic to have Emma, but also our other two experts. And I really want to thank Milestone Institute to make this happen, and so that we can have this conversation from which I hope you have had lots of ideas what you can do, or just provoke new thoughts. And even if nothing else, if you just keep chatting about this with your friends, you've already done a lot. There is one really big climate influencer, one of the with the biggest follower base is Catherine Hayhoe. She's in the US and she's a scientist with a big follower base. And she says, if there is one thing you want to do for the climate, just talk about it. So if you get out of here and just talk about all the things that we have talked about today, maybe debate these with your friends, you may have different thoughts, you've already done your bit for today for the climate. So thank you all so much for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you.